Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Zafar, and in this video we're going to talk about Angular components. So first of all, what is a component, right? In single page application, we kind of think differently about user interfaces, right? In the traditional web development, we kind of think of web applications or websites as your HTML files, your CSS files, and your JavaScript files. But in single page applications, we look at a user interface and kind of think of them as components, right? So for example, this is the Angular documentation page for components. We can see on the top we have like a thick, navigation bar, so that can be a component, right? We can call it like a navigation bar component. And we have a search, component here, so we can, that can be a separate component. On the right hand side, we can see we have like kind of a sidebar of bullet points of this page. We can also think of that as a component. So if we scroll down a little bit, we can also see the code portion here, an example. That can also be a component. So we have to start thinking about user interfaces in terms of components. Okay, so let's take a look at how Angular handles components. So I'm going to come to my terminal and create a new Angular application. All right, so now it finished creating all the files, and I'm going to do a list so we can see we have the Hello Components new project. So I'm going to cd into it, and I can list here. So you can open the Hello Components from your favorite code editor. I happen to use Code, so I can do, or Visual Studio Code, so I can do code dot, and that will open up the current directory. Just close that, and we're going to maximize this. So this is the default Angular application, or the starting point that Angular CLI gives us. And we have the E2E directory, that's your end-to-end tests. And you have the node modules, that's your dependencies. But we're interested in the source app, and that's where all your source code goes. So first of all, let's serve the application quickly to our browser with ngserve. So it's going to go ahead and compile all the code and serve it to the browser so we can open. So this is the default application that Angular CLI generates for us. So let's take a look at appcomponent.ts. Okay, so this is what a component in Angular looks like, or at least the TypeScript portion of it. And we'll explore the other aspects of a component. So notice the first thing we do, the first line, we're importing component from Angular core library. So component, this thing right here is a decorator. Okay, so we have add component, that's a decorator. And a decorator like decorates a class in TypeScript, so it's right above it. And we pass this decorator an object, right? This object contains metadata about our component. Okay, so on line 4 we see the selector, and we'll see how that's used. But that's the name of the component. You know, in HTML, how we have like a P or like an H1 or a div. So the selector is the name for the component, so we can use it in HTML files, right? So you can think of components kind of, Angular gives us the ability to create custom HTML tags, if you will, but obviously they're more involved. But that's a starting point to think of it. On line 5, we have the template URL, and this tells Angular where the HTML file that goes along with this component. Okay, and on line 6, we have the styles URL. So obviously you can style your components, and that's the style sheet for that component. And notice we have, so basically it's a TypeScript class, and we're exporting it, and it's called app component, and it has one property, right, called title, and the value is just hello component. So let's take a look at the HTML portion, right? We have the template URL pointing to appcomponent.html. So this is the file right here, and let's take a look at it. So that should look familiar if you have used HTML in the past. So it says the content below is only a placeholder. So we have a div tag, right, and it has some styles, and we have an H1. But notice this weird looking, syntax. If we look at the browser, it says welcome to Hello Components, which is the name of our application. But if we look at the HTML, there's kind of like a weird thing going on here. So what this is called, it's called interpolation. Okay? And what that means is that Angular gives us the ability to kind of put snippets or kind of inject code inside those HTML. So anything between the double curly brackets is not treated as just, it's not treated as like a string, or you're not going to see that in the page, but that will be evaluated, right? It's JavaScript that will be evaluated before the user sees it, right? So then the question is where does this title come from, right? Where is it defined? And it's actually defined in the component class that we took a look at, right? And that's on line 9. So you can think of a component as kind of like two files that go hand in hand. Okay, you have the TypeScript file, and that's the logic of the component. That's the logic that backs the component. And we have the HTML file, which is just the view, right? But obviously we need to inject, maybe variables, or we need to use methods inside this HTML file. So they both go hand in hand. So now the question is, how did Angular know, right? How did it know to render this specific component? Because I can have 10 or 100 different components in my application. But if we take a look at the, application that got served to the browser, we see this specific component. So the answer is inside of app module, right? So if we take a look at app module, right, we see a couple of import statements, and notice on line 6 we have another decorator, and this is the ng module decorator, and it decorates a class, and this class doesn't have anything, it's just empty. So what a module is in Angular, you can think of it as kind of a group of components, right? It groups components and maybe other modules. It borrows functionality from other modules, and one shouldn't confuse Angular modules with JavaScript modules, right? This is a very common point of confusion, is that because they're named the same thing, but Angular has a completely different it's a completely different concept, right? What a module is. So again, a module is a collection of components, right? So when you create components, right, you must declare where the component or which module owns that component, right? So if we take a look at the ng module, right, we're passing an object, and that again provides metadata for our module. And we can see on line 8 that we have or line 7, we have a declaration array, and we're specifying app component. So what that means is that app component belongs to app module. Okay, so you can have as many as you want here, but every component must belong somewhere. You can't just have, components kind of floating around in your Angular application. So you must declare the component in some module, right? So you can think of modules as a group of components, group of maybe other modules. For example, on line 10, we have an imports array. So we're kind of borrowing functionality from other modules, but we're not going to worry too much about it. But here we're just importing the browser module. But the answer to the question that we started off with, how does Angular know which component to render when we served our application to the browser, and it's right here. So it specifies that app component is the bootstrap component for our entire application. Okay, so that's the very first component that gets rendered when the user navigate to localhost 4200 when we're developing. So now the question is, if I have another component, how do I render that? Okay, so I'm going to use the Angular CLI to create, and let me open another terminal. So I'm going to do ng for Angular, g for generate, c for component, and I'll call it first, right? So this will go ahead and create a new component for me. And notice immediately the Angular CLI included that first component inside the declaration array, so you don't have to do it yourself. So it's really nice, so you don't have to do all the wiring yourself. But it's a good practice to, when you're starting off, to, instead of using the Angular CLI, to kind of go through the steps to see how all the pieces relate. So now we have inside of app, remember we said all our source code goes inside of source app. So now we see first, and that's the new component. So if we take a look at the HTML for our component, by default, it gives you this first works, right? Or the name of the component and then works. So suppose I want to render this component inside, right? Like I want to see this component on this page, right? Like how do we do it? So there's a couple of different ways to render components based on your needs, but the very simplest way is, if you remember in the first component.ts, right, we have a selector, and we said that the selector is the name of the component, right? So we can use it in HTML, kind of like how we have an h1 or an h2 or a p tag or a div tag. So now I can use app first as a tag inside other components that will render this component. Does that make sense? So I can go to my app HTML, and maybe, I want to get rid of all this. I don't need it. So I can render, maybe I can say like an h1, this is the app component. So to verify, I can scroll here, and we can see this is the app component. So now at the bottom, if I want to render another component, I will use its selector, right? So the selector for the first component that we just created is just app first. And if I scroll to the right, notice now we see the first works. So the first work is actually a different component that we just created, but app component is the kind of like the parent of the first component, right? And it's rendering it. So I hope this video was helpful. Let me know in the comments below if you have any questions. Let me know if you have any suggestions for future videos or any topics you would like to learn more about.